One of the most prestigious achievements a film can achieve is being the highest grossing film of all time. Aside from winning awards at film festivals and at the Oscars and leaving a massive cultural impact, being one of the highest grossing films solidifies your film as a massive milestone in film history and can often coincide with these previous two things as well, and shows that hundreds of millions of people from around the globe have seen and enjoyed your film, leading to massive opportunities for the people involved, with the studios raking in all of that profit as well. Throughout the decades, new massive films appear every once in a while to take away this title and appeal to a wide variety of people during that time period, but all share many things in common. Today I'll be taking a look at the history of every film that was one time the highest grossing film in the whole world, and examining the circumstances of why that was the case, along with everything else I learned on this topic. With that being said, let's dive straight into things. Let's go back over 100 years now to establish the very first highest grossing film of all time. Finding the very first one, though, is an extremely difficult task that is quite impossible. There were very few places that counted the countrywide gross for movies in the US, and you can forget about worldwide gross as well, as there wasn't a single place that counted the total amount of money a movie made across the world, as there was basically no convenient way of doing that. Nowadays, it's extremely easy to find out how much a movie was made on any given day in the US or in other countries, but up until recently, that wasn't the case. Box Office Mojo, the primary company that tracks this data, was only founded in 1998, with reliable data existing only up until the 1970s. Therefore, the earlier you go, the harder it is to find box office numbers for films from the 60s and prior, and they're only rough estimates. But we have to start somewhere, and unfortunately, although this film is well known, it's perhaps one of the most controversial films of all time with a very nasty legacy today. Yup, the very first highest grossing film of all time is The Birth of a Nation, the historical epic that glorified and brought back the KKK into US culture. I'm not going to dive into the details of why this film is so controversial, that's a topic for a different day. But Birth of a Nation was something that audiences had never seen before. Most people had never seen a film or a film like this, and were astonished by what a movie could actually be. Despite the racist subject matter of the film, Birth of a Nation demonstrated many filmmaking techniques most had never seen before, crafting a brand new experience accessible to anybody who could go to a theater and buy a ticket. Tickets cost around $2 for the film at its premiere in 1915, which is a whopping $62 today with inflation. And by next year, around 3 million people in the US had seen the film, close to 3% of the population. But the thing about movies back then was that they would remain in theaters for years. Nowadays, some movies don't even remain in theaters for a month before hitting home video. But up until recent decades, movies would remain in theaters for much longer, since streaming services weren't a thing and would take a while before they could be physically bought or rented or played somewhere else on cable TV. Speaking of TV, televisions wouldn't exist for another decade when Birth of the Nation came out, and most Americans didn't own a TV until the 1950s, which explains why even then, people went out to see movies. Birth of the Nation remains the most popular and well-known film from the 1910s today, and considered to be the first truly big film from Hollywood. Birth of a Nation remained the highest grossing film for nearly 25 years, a quarter of a century, and by the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History, an estimated 200 million people had seen The Birth of a Nation by 1946, nearly 9% of the Earth's total population at the time. Adjusted for inflation, the total gross of the film is around $1.8 billion today, an extraordinary number, but definitely not the highest we'll see today. Fortunately, Birth of the Nation's reign at the top wouldn't last forever, and at the end of the 1930s, we saw a new film take the crown. Released in 1939, the legendary film Gone with the Wind was an enormous success, an epic historical romance drama set during the beginning of the Civil War. Like Birth of a Nation, Gone with the Wind is another historic film with a massive scope, and also being one of the very first films entirely in color, coming in at nearly 4 hours. But also like Birth of a Nation, Gone with the Wind remains quite controversial today for glorifying how amazing the South of the US was back then, despite the poor portrayal of African Americans in the film, and glossing over the inhumanity that is slavery, supporting ideas typically associated with the lost cause. which in short is basically the Confederate States of America were heroes who didn't fight for slavery and whose culture was basically entirely destroyed, a controversial topic even to this day. But when discussing the film itself, and not its story, themes, or ideas, it makes sense why this film was so successful. Most Americans and others around the world had never seen a film like this, a massive sprawling epic not in black and white but in color, and broke audience attendance records all around the world when it came out, being nearly universally acclaimed at the time and winning many Oscars. Although even then there were many detractors when it came to the way the film portrayed race, and time hasn't been quite as kind to this film like many others. Romance films, especially during that time up until the 2010s, was one of the biggest genres, as we'll see later, attracting male and female audiences alike, which helped contribute to the film's success. Gone with the Wind became the highest grossing film for 25 years like Birth of the Nation, grossing approximately $390 million at the time. But adjusted for inflation, Gone with the Wind is the highest grossing film of all time, its estimated gross being $4.45 billion, an absolutely astronomical number that I'm doubtful will ever be beaten. Epics like this would continue to dominate for the next few decades, with many other films similar to this doing great numbers, but Gone with the Wind remains on the top in the end. Despite its controversies, Gone with the Wind showed that technical achievements in film and appealing to the widest group of people possible leads to crazy numbers financially, a pattern we will continue to see. Gone with the Wind streak at the top ended in 1966, when the previous year's Best Picture winner, the musical The Sound of Music, broke that record. Another massive historical drama, The Sound of Music wasn't the most acclaimed film at the time, but more recently has received more acclaim. A light-hearted story for audiences for all ages to enjoy, even though it's set against the rise of the Nazis and how that affected Austria, it served as a comfort film to millions across the globe. The 60s and early 70s were the peak of popularity for musicals, and was one of the most popular genres at the time, with films like Mary Poppins, West Side Story, and My Fair Lady being massive critical and commercial successes, with The Sound of Music being the biggest one. The Sound of Music was also one of the first movies to be dubbed internationally in languages such as German, French, Italian, and Spanish, helping immensely and being extremely popular in every country except the ones where the story takes place, Austria and West Germany, surprisingly. The Sound of Music was estimated to have grossed around $287.8 million at the time, less than Gone with the Wind, but that's probably due to re-releases, but adjusted for inflation, grossing a little over $3 billion, a very impressive feat, and held its title for a little over 5 years until 1972. Considered one of, if not the most acclaimed film of all time, The Godfather was the next film to take that title. The Godfather is a little bit of an anomaly on this list. An R-rated dark crime drama about a family of gangsters isn't something most would expect to be massively successful, but thinking about it a little more makes sense. Most audiences had never seen a film like this before, because, well, there really wasn't any film that portrayed gangsters and mobsters as intelligent, conniving criminals. The new age of Hollywood brought in new perspectives of what it means to be a young person in this day and age, with directors like Martin Scorsese, Robert Altman, Woody Allen, William Friedkin, and many others bringing in dark and gritty films that were immensely successful in the 70s, critically and commercially, with Francis Ford Coppola's films, especially The Godfather, bringing in this change. This film has been talked to death already. There are probably hundreds of videos out there that can discuss this in much more detail. But yeah, most of you know why this film was so revolutionary and so acclaimed, and very shortly after its release grossed over $250 million and being the highest grossing film the year of its release. In today's money, that would be around over $1 billion. Not bad at all. All of these previous films have been historical epics, a genre nearly always guaranteed to make loads of money. But this next film would introduce a type of film that makes loads of money as well. The Godfather had a short reign at the top with only around 3 years, until the massive film Jaws released in the summer of 1975. One of the most impactful films of all time, Jaws is considered by many the first summer blockbuster of all time, meant to attract wide groups of people. Steven Spielberg demonstrated here and with future titles that he understands how to appeal to a wide group of people, while creating a fantastic film along with that. Appealing to younger audiences, Jaws still remains one of the most iconic films of all time. Most blockbusters are released in summer for obvious reasons. Kids are off from school and adults go on vacation. So spending a few dollars to buy a ticket and some drinks and snacks back then wasn't a big deal. And with so few films like this, and the long releases of films, it makes sense that Jaws would be such a success. and even today, over 50 years later, it still holds up and is thrilling all throughout. Jaws in its initial few years made around $470 million and obliterated its competition. With inflation, Jaws' total gross is over $2 billion, a massive success, but it doesn't even crack the top 10 highest grossing films of all time, which we'll see at the end. Jaws had the shortest run as the highest grossing movie of all time. Only a couple years later, another impactful blockbuster was released that everybody you'll ever meet knows about. That's right, I'm talking about 1977's Star Wars, or A New Hope as it was later retitled. Before it was even released, many weren't sure if Star Wars would be even a minor success. Sci-fi movies had existed before it, like with 2001: A Space Odyssey and the Planet of the Apes movies, among others. But Star Wars was a big and bold film with a hefty budget, and it was unknown if the movie would ever be profitable. In May of that year, Star Wars opened in a whopping 32 theaters. Yeah, 32 theaters. But even with such a small release, Star Wars was an instant success. And that summer and the next was an enormous success and launched one of the biggest franchises in the whole world. Not only a critical darling, Star Wars was the very first movie to gross over $500 million worldwide, especially being a success in the US and Canada. And as we all know, launched a billion-dollar franchise with new projects every year. A fun summer blockbuster meant for all audiences, like Jaws before it, it's pretty easy to see why audiences flock to see the movie, and developed such a cult following years after that exists to this very day. Even when it was re-released in 1997, making an additional $138 million. Its sequels would make much less than the original film, but even adjusted for inflation, the original Star Wars film is still easily one of the highest grossing movies of all time, grossing over $3.6 billion. And holding the title for the highest grossing film for 5 years. Lucas's close friend Steven Spielberg debated whether Star Wars or Spielberg's film Close Encounters of the Third Kind would gross more, with Spielberg losing. But don't worry though, he would surpass it with another sci-fi alien film. E.T. the Extraterrestrial was another summer blockbuster audiences loved. An amazing movie that appealed to kids and adults equally, Spielberg solidified the future of successful movies. Big action or sci-fi spectacles meant for the big screen that anybody can love no matter who they are, and their preferences in film as well. Spielberg cracked the box office code for the next few decades, with many filmmakers following or taking their path to make audiences see their movies. Toys and merchandise were also a massive part to help promote the film, with toys of the titular alien and video games also helping for the film to reach a much wider audience. Also, the fact that many films like these would stay in theaters for longer allowed them to be successful during periods where people were out of school or work, or when there just wasn't anything good or interesting in theaters, something that doesn't happen much nowadays. Another revolutionary film, E.T. held the record for the highest grossing film for the rest of the 80s and early 90s as well, until Spielberg himself surpassed that achievement once again. In 1993, the same year as he released one of the greatest films of all time, Schindler's List, in December, a few months before that in the summer, Spielberg released a film adaptation of the novel Jurassic Park. Featuring groundbreaking CGI and special effects that hold up to this very day, Spielberg turned a partially horror novel into another one of his crowd-pleasing blockbusters for the whole family. Tons of action, plenty of rewatchability, and tons of merchandise to purchase before and after the film. Jurassic Park not only was the launch of a new franchise of dinosaur movies, but also a revolutionary film that showed how new technology could help create films that were seemingly impossible beforehand. Jurassic Park set box office records all across the world. Spielberg's highest grossing film, upon further re-releases, Jurassic Park would later gross a little over $1.1 billion, while adjusted for inflation adds another billion to make it $2.1 billion. Still a very impressive feat, but it doesn't even touch the top 10 as we'll see later. Around 5 years later, Spielberg's run at the top of the box office finally came to a close, and another director would take up that mantle. One of, if not the most iconic romance films of all time, Titanic would become the first movie to gross $1 billion, but it didn't start off that way. Titanic was a success when it released, but in later weeks it grew in enormous popularity, and by the end of its run had somehow grossed nearly twice as much as Jurassic Park did. The late 90s were the peak for romance movies, and James Cameron had become one of the most successful directors in the world with his first two Terminator films, Aliens and True Lies. So when this epic blockbuster released at the end of 1997, audiences flooded to see it. Many people were in awe at the special effects or brought to tears by Jack and Rose's relationship. Many people seeing the film numerous times for this reason. It only took 74 days to gross $1 billion, and winning Best Picture and many other prizes at the Oscars helped out the film as well, and by the end of its run grossed $1.8 billion. Adjusted for inflation, that's $3.7 billion, but re-releases adding more to that gross as well. James Cameron really was the king of the world for the next 12 years, with audiences awaiting his next film as Titanic was still dominant at the top. But like the moneymaker he is, surpassed his feat with an even grander film than this. Released at the end of 2009, Avatar was one of the most groundbreaking films of all time upon release. Basically everything in Avatar was all visual effects, motion capture, and CGI effects, something never previously done before entirely in a movie. And for the most part, they still hold up decently to this very day. The anticipation of the movie was enormous, and given the recent rise in popularities and seeing movies in 3D and at IMAX screens, along with this being Cameron's follow-up to Titanic, this movie was always going to be a massive success. But somehow, it still exceeded expectations. It took 19 days to achieve $1 billion and 47 days to achieve $2 billion, the first film to ever do so. And by the end of its run, Avatar grossed $2.7 billion. Avatar held this record for another decade or so before it was surpassed. But don't worry, its story isn't over yet. The 2010s saw movies make billions at the box office more than ever before. And with the rise of more franchises and superhero films finally taking more hits than misses, led to crazy numbers, with the end of the decade solidifying it. A total of 9 movies made over $1 billion at the box office that year, with 4 of those movies being based on comic book characters. But the one we're talking about here is of course Avengers Endgame. I can't emphasize how massive this movie was on release. Avengers Endgame was the culmination of 22 films in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and the eagerly anticipated follow-up to Avengers Endgame, which itself made over $2 billion. So everybody wanted to see this movie, and see it they did. Endgame is the first and only movie to make over $1 billion in its opening weekend, making a sick $1.2 billion, doubling the previous record of $640 million made by Avengers Infinity War. That was the one thing people were talking about the next week. I remember everyone talking about how Iron Man and Captain America had died, and what was next in the future for the MCU. I can't see any movie making that amount of money in its first weekend ever again. But in a few short months, Avengers Endgame surpassed Avatar to become the newest highest grossing film, dethroning the past few decades ruled by Spielberg and Cameron. But don't worry though, even though it was an absurd success, it wouldn't hold that title for very long. You see, when Avatar The Way of Water was released, people were super excited to see it, the sequel finally coming out 13 years after the first. But there was a whole new generation of people who had never seen the original film in theaters or at home, so now was the perfect time to release the original film, and that's what they did. And even before Way of Water was going to be released, a special version of the film was released in China in March of 2021, surpassing Endgame to once again becoming the highest grossing film, with that re-release adding an additional $60 million. Endgame had only grossed a little over $10 million more than Avatar, so it was quite easy and convenient to surpass this feat, with a re-release this year adding enough to make Avatar's total gross as of now to be $2.92 billion. If Avatar gets more re-releases when the 4th and 5th installments of the franchise get released, it's safe to say that this film will become the first film to make $3 billion at the box office without inflation. And honestly, I don't see any film in the next few years coming close to this, especially considering less people going to the theaters than ever, and the decline in popularity in superhero films. But Endgame is supposed to have a re-release before Avengers Doomsday comes out, so who knows what the future holds for us. So that's where this story ends for now. But what about the final stats? Specifically, the highest grossing films of all time, and what that looks like adjusted for inflation, along with how award shows treat these films. Let's start with what are the 10 highest grossing films of all time, which is subject to change once Avatar Fire and Ash finishes its run in theaters, but who knows. As of early January 2025, at number 10 we have 2015's Jurassic World. Number 9 is Pixar's Inside Out 2. Number 8 is Spider-Man: No Way Home. Number 7 is Avengers: Infinity War, the beginning of the $2 billion movies and more. Number 6 is Star Wars: The Force Awakens. Number 5 is Ninja 2, the highest grossing animated and foreign movie. Number 4 is Titanic. Number 3 is Avatar: The Way of Water. Number 2 is Avengers: Endgame. And number 1 is, of course, Avatar. Not the most surprising list, big blockbusters and all, but adjusted for inflation list is much more interesting. Number 10 on that list is Star Wars: The Force Awakens, which we also saw on that list. But number 9 is David Lean's 1965 film Dr. Zhivago. I would have expected to see his more known films like The Bridge on the River Kwai or Lawrence of Arabia instead of this, but still impressive. Number 8 is the 1956 historical epic The Ten Commandments, and the rest I've already talked about already. 7 is E.T., 6 is The Sound of Music, 5 is Avengers: Endgame, 4 is the original Star Wars, 3 is Titanic, 2 is Avatar, and 1 is of course Gone with the Wind. Especially for these older films, inflation really helps bring up these numbers and show how successful these films were back then, and how most of these films still have some cultural impact. But finally, let's talk about what critics and individuals in the film industry, specifically the Oscars, had to say. Out of the 11 films that at one time held the title of highest grossing film in the world, 8 of them were nominated for Best Picture, with 4 of them winning. And when it comes to other 3 films not nominated, the Oscars didn't exist when Birth of a Nation came out. Spielberg also released Schindler's List at that time, so lots of praise went there instead of to Jurassic Park. And when it comes to Avengers: Endgame, there's no real excuse for that. And practically all of these films won loads of technical prizes as well when it comes to prizes like cinematography and film editing, showing how impactful these films were not only to general film audiences, but the people making these types of films as well. And there we have it, the entire list and history of the films that were the highest grossing films in the world. From historical epics to summer blockbusters, we saw the change and landscape of what types of films audiences were in the mood to see, and how that shaped the modern day landscape we live in today. It'll be interesting to see the next generation of movies that make an absurd amount of money, like the films that came before it. But that, we just have to wait and see. Thank you all so much for watching this video. Like and subscribe for more content like this. If you want to watch a video about the king of the box office himself, James Cameron, then click this video right here. Anyways, that's it for today, and I hope to see you all next time.